enjoy the webinar.
Thank you, Miriam.
Thank you.
All right, so welcome everyone to the Asylum project webinar, Resettlement, Complementary Pathways, and the United Nations Global Compact on Refugees. My name is Sergio Carrera. I'm a senior research fellow at CEPS in Brussels, and also the coordinator of the Asylum project. And I'm very happy to welcome you all to this very special event that we are hosting on the occasion of the launch of a special issue that has been published by the journal Frontiers in Human Dynamics. And in this event, we will be enjoying the presentation of the different papers that comprise this special issue. First of all, my thanks and congratulations to the editors of the special issue, Adèle Garnier, assistant professor at the University of Laval in Canada, Nick Tan, senior researcher at the Danish Institute for Human Rights, and also Asylum senior researcher, and Naoko Hashimoto, who is not with us today. She's at the University of Hitotsubashi, and she's also part of the editing team. And of course, to all the contributors that participate today in the panel, who will be presenting their excellent papers. Very briefly about the Asylum project, the Horizon 2020 project that studies the interactions between emerging asylum governance systems around the world and the United Nations Global Compact on Refugees. The project pays particular focus and attention to the compatibility between these systems and international and regional human rights and refugee protection standards. And we are engaging in a critical examination of actors and instruments in respect of policy instruments that are usually conveyed as promising practices or good practices. We are debunking those instruments through an examination of their implementation. And some of those instruments, as we shall see today, and this is also covered by the various papers comprising the journal, the special journal issue, are labeled as third country solutions or complementary pathways. The project is studying some of these in selected countries like Canada, Brazil, South Africa, Jordan, and Turkey. And we are investigating both the inclusionary and mobility components, but also their exclusionary features, paying attention to questions such as accessibility to those instruments, structural vulnerability questions, the ways in which they actually co-create vulnerability of applicants, and issues related to non-discrimination and the right to work. And also the project looks quite specially at the European Union's role in implementing the Global Compact on Refugees. So there is a stream of research also dedicated to EU instruments with non-European countries. And here we are looking at not only Turkey, but also other countries like Niger, Tunisia, and Serbia. So our intention in this project is to draw lessons and key findings when thinking about what role the European Union can or should play when implementing the Global Compact on Refugees in a way that is fully compatible, not only with international refugee law that exists, but also human rights. So today, I think it is a pleasure for us in the project to host also this event, because we considered it the kind of investigation and research that you guys have put together as a step forward in the same direction. So joining forces is really a pleasure. I will immediately give the floor to Adèle, who will be taking us through the panel arrangements and speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sergio. Welcome, everybody. And I'm very, very happy to see so many contributors as a special issue today from different parts of the world. I have co-edited the issue with Naoko Hashimoto. Nick Tan was a contributor, but he's also a member of the Asylum Network, so really was a great help in organizing the seminar. So this is fantastic opportunity, really. And what I will do is I'm going to say a few words about what refugee resettlement and complementary pathways are. Then I will just say a few words about what the Global Compact for Refugees is and the third objective, really, in relation to the expansion of what's called third country solutions. And then I'll come to the special issue per se before organizing the session in two parts with two contributors and one commentator in each part. So I'll come to that at the end. So just to set the stage, because I'm not exactly sure who is listening to us today, but refugee resettlement is the discretionary transfer and admission of refugees from countries or first countries of asylum by states. So this is a discretionary process of states who willingly admit refugees, and is not based on international law in the same way that asylum is. And when we talk about refugee resettlement, most the understanding, the traditional understanding that refugees are referred to resettling countries by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugee, or UNHCR. And it is considered to be one of three durable solutions of UNHCR to force displacement, alongside integration in the refugees' first country of asylum and voluntary return of refugees to their country of origin. Okay, so this discretionary aspect to refugee resettlement is very important, but also the fact that in the traditional understanding of refugee resettlement, the referral is done by UNHCR. And in the last decades, the focus has been on the vulnerability, the specific vulnerability of refugees to be resettled. So they have fled persecution, but on top of that, they're particularly vulnerable. And what is complementary pathways? So this is a term that has been for several years, and it refers to additional avenues of protection alongside resettlement that don't necessarily go through a referral of UNHCR. So, okay, I'm going to try to focus on the camera because of sound. Complementary pathways, some countries are considered to be have a long experience in this country that also traditionally resettle more refugees than others, especially Canada and Australia, for instance, and is experiencing sort of a boom in the last few years, and as we will talk about in the second part of the seminar. Now, it is important to mention that less than 1% of all refugees in the world ever get the opportunity to be resettled. So it's a very small stream of protections for refugees that has been less highlighted in the literature than other avenues of protection, but there is an emerging trend and more literature, and so this special issue contributes to this. Now, just a few words on the Global Compact for Refugees. So this is an initiative that was adopted by the United Nations in 2018, in December 2018, after the adoption of the United Nations Declaration on Refugees and Migrants in New York in 2016. So there was sort of a renewal of the focus on international protection. With this declaration in 2016, the international context was that it was the end of the Obama presidency, the beginning of the Syrian refugee crisis, or the sort of the moment of international cooperation with the refugee crisis. But by the time the Global Compact on refugees was adopted, it was the Trump presidency, the context was quite different. But the purpose was to I'm trying to sort of read my notes and not move away from the camera. It was to a framework for more predictable and equitable responsibility sharing in the realm of forced displacement. So the UNHCR described it as the blueprint to realize this in cooperation with many actors, not just states, but also civil society, private actors, refugees themselves. So there is a focus on refugee agency at the core of the Global Compact. It's a non-binding text, but the United Nations are trying to sort of have instruments to facilitate implementation with pledges that actors are making and want to be accountable in the form of a Global Refugee Forum that is supposed to occur every 4 years to see how the Global Compact is being implemented. So it's not a binding instrument, but it's a form of trying to have actors accountable to their pledges. The Global Compact on Refugees was hailed by some as a minor miracle, notably Volker Turk, who is the former Assistant Commissioner for Protection of UNHCR. But others have been more critical, especially because it is non-binding, but also, for instance, because of the vocabulary. It's a Global Compact on Refugees, whereas there is another one that is the Global Compact for Migrations. And because some find it too timid in its aspiration. There are specific paragraphs in the Compact on Refugees on refugee resettlement and complementary pathways, and this is linked to the 4 objectives of the Global Compact. Are enhancing refugee self-reliance, supporting conditions in countries of origin to safety and dignity of refugees, the one that we are concerned with today is expanding access to third country solutions. And so there are 6 sections, section 90 to 96 on refugee resettlement and complementary pathways. And there is a strategy that UNHCR has adopted to expand refugee, so a 3-year strategy on the expansion of refugee resettlement that was supposed to run from 2019 to 2020 and considerably expand the number of resettlement places to 3 million and complementary pathways by 2028. However, the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic occurred in the meantime. It has not just hampered international travel, it has also considerably reduced the arrival of refugees because it was impossible to travel during a long time. So it has had a very severe negative impact on the implementation of the Compact for Refugees and Refugee Resettlement. Okay, so now how does this relate to our special issue? Because when we started the special issue, we didn't have specifically the Global Compact on Refugees in focus, but there is a lot of questions that our contributions make that intersect with questions that are discussed, that intersect with topics that are important for the Compact. For instance, if we look at the expansion of avenues for refugees to be resettled, the question is there going to be competitions between the different avenues? Is the system going to be easy to comprehend by refugees, or is it just making the system more complex? Is everyone going to have the same kind of definition of vulnerability, for instance, of the requirements for refugees to be resettled? What are going to be the specific requirements that can be made for refugees to be resettled in different contexts? What is actually the agency of refugees if we consider expanding refugee resettlement and complementary pathways? Is this agency actually increased or not? Is it just window dressing, or does it actually work to enhance the agency of refugees? So if we look at the expansion of complementary pathways, so refugee resettlement is already discretionary, but complementary pathways really rely on the goodwill of civil society. So how do we make this goodwill of civil society more durable? And then another important aspect of the Global Compact for Refugees is the transfer of best practice. So how can we transfer or diffuse best practice across the world? These are all questions that are mentioned and discussed in the special issue. And this is why we are spotlighting 4 of our so far 6 published contributions today. So I will just first mention 2 of papers that have yet to be published. So just to say a word on our issue, so the journal Frontiers in Human Dynamics is open access. So if you go on the website of Frontiers in Human Dynamics, you can find a link to all contributions that have been published. There might still be some in the pipeline, but I can't say anything because they're peer reviewed. But as soon as they are published, they're accessible to the public, and they have different formats. So there are research articles, shorter research notes, and literature reviews. So the papers representing this morning as research articles and brief research notes, and we also have a literature published. So the 2 contributions, and I do hope that some of the authors are here and that won't present this. A contribution by Hannah Schneider from the Pre-University Brussels. When she look at the multi-level governance of refugee resettlement in the context of resettlement from Jordan and Turkey of Syrian refugees to Germany. And the other contribution that we're also very happy to have at the existing literature on refugees, resettled refugees with disability in Germany and Canada. So you can find them this one is forthcoming and will be available in a few weeks. I'm going to start now speaking about our first block of contributions, and I'm introducing the speakers and they will start. So in this first part, we are talking about the contribution on refugee resettlement and the question of vulnerability in light of the Global Compact for Refugees. The first presenter is Nathalie Welfens, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the Hertie School of Governance in Berlin, and Yasmin Rico, doctoral candidate at the Institute of Political Science at the University Erlangen. And they are going to talk about the politics of vulnerability in the admission under the EU agreement. And then we will have Agathe Menit, doctoral candidate at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris, on implementing refugee resettlement of secrecy, a case of resettlement from Africa. And these two papers will be discussed in light of the GCR by Eltem Iladiga, assistant of the Faculty of Law at the Suleiman Demirel in Turkey and an asylum researcher. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction, and thank you everyone for joining. Hello. I will, with Nathalie Welfens, now present our brief research report on the politics of vulnerability, not in light of the Global Compact on refugees, but in light of the EU-Turkey statement. And in our report, we have asked ourselves, what does the concept of vulnerability denote in refugee admission policies and practices? And we focused on the EU-Turkey statement, as I've already said, and on admissions to Germany, drawing on both of our dissertation projects. So what does vulnerability mean in policy in this case? You can go to the next slide, thank you. Whereas academia, especially feminist political theory, has come to define vulnerability as universal to everyone, meaning that it is created by dynamic circumstances. Policy still takes on a more traditional approach, as is seen here, as vulnerability is defined as a static label to categorize some groups or individuals as vulnerable and to grant them certain procedures, entitlements, or protection. The groups listed here in the left column are all labels that have been attached to vulnerability in policy. And interestingly, even in EU policy, the definitions differ, as you can see in the second and in the third column. In addition, when it comes to resettlement or humanitarian admission programs, even in the EU context, the criteria are based on UNHCR's resettlement criteria, which you can see in the right column, where, for instance, women and children are defined as vulnerable, whereas in the EU legislation, gender and gender identity is considered. Now, looking more closely at the implications for the EU-Turkey statement, it becomes evident that definitions of vulnerability also serve different functions depending on the context. In the EU-Turkey statement, one of the mostly criticized aspects is the one-to-one mechanism, which means that for every irregular migrant that is returned from Greek islands to Turkey, a Syrian is resettled to Europe from Turkey. In policy, only persons who are vulnerable are exempt from the return to Turkey from Greek islands. And in this case, Greek national legislation applies, which implements EU policy, but it remains unclear whether and how it is assessed and how it is monitored. More importantly, when it comes to the admission from Turkey to the EU, UNHCR submission categories apply of vulnerability, but also interact with additional criteria. So namely, the persons must be vulnerable, the persons must be Syrian, the persons that already have a nuclear family legally residing in Europe are to be preferred. And national admission policies also apply. So in the case of Germany, for instance, there is a limit of 3% of severe medical cases of the total agreed upon quota. And also Germany wants integration capacity, whatever that means, to be included in the selection. This variety of criteria, we argue, with vulnerability being defined differently in different policy and also its role being nuanced depending on the context, further raises questions as to how the different actors prioritize and select refugees for admission at the front line, and this will now be discussed by Natalie.
Thanks so much. Yeah, so I will very briefly touch upon the question of how vulnerability is assessed in practice, and this draws on my doctoral research on the humanitarian admission programs for Syrian refugees from Turkey to Germany. And what you see here is a still very simplified version of what I call in my research the chain of refugee admission. So this is only the selection chain. And as I said, still simplified, where you see all the different actors that are involved in the process. And I use this notion to basically show that it's not only at the final front line of admission states where they decide about inclusion or exclusion, but it is really throughout a number of steps that vulnerability, but also other criteria are assessed. So it starts with NGOs or the Turkish migration authorities identifying cases for resettlement, which are then further assessed by UNHCR, submitted to an admission state like Germany. Then the migration authorities of the admission state, in the German case, the BAMF, takes the formal decision about inclusion or exclusion, and then the Turkish migration authorities, DGMM, still have to issue an exit permit. And vulnerability plays a role throughout these different steps of the process, but as I said, it interferes with other criteria. And if you want, in a nutshell, one could argue that at the beginning of the process, vulnerability is rather pronounced as a criterion when NGOs and state officials identify particularly vulnerable cases. But the further a dossier travels along this chain, the more other criteria also relating to security and integration are at play. And although there's also these different actors share a number of vulnerability definitions, for example, the focus on vulnerable women and children, they still have a lot of discretionary room. And hence this interaction with other criteria. I'm happy to discuss more about this in the discussion, but as time is very short, I'll already jump to our main conclusions. So as we've argued in the first part of the paper, that is about vulnerability in policies, where we see that in EU policies overall, we see this rather static and very group-based approach in which some groups count as per se vulnerable than others. And the very definition of vulnerability remains rather vague, as well as the interaction with other criteria. We see the similar tendency of a very group-based understanding of vulnerability also in assessment practices and the interaction with other criteria. However, in practices, we see a number of different actors using vulnerability as a criterion who all have discretionary decision-making power. So overall, our contribution argues that really, although it is often proclaimed that resettlement and similar admission pathways are for the most vulnerable refugees, vulnerability really at the end of the day is only one of several criteria that determine access to these kind of programs, and that other criteria relating to security or to integration, for example, exacerbate actually existing vulnerabilities or even create new ones. Thus, overall, one can say that vulnerability is rather a potential claim and definitely a buzzword around resettlement and complementary pathways, but it remains quite difficult to scrutinize whether this is actually taken seriously, both legally and politically. And with that, I thank you for your attention and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Natalie. And then we turn to Agathe.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for this opportunity to shed light on some aspects of my article. This article draws on a year-long ethnography I conducted in Africa for my PhD project. For the sake of my informant's anonymity, we chose not to precise the specific countries in this particular paper. So besides conducting interviews with agents of the asylum system, I followed a group of LGBT Africans who fled homophobic persecutions in their country of origin. So here I name the country of origin country A, and they were residing in a neighboring country, which I name here country B. They were hoping for resettlement to the global north. For most of them, it was Canada. However, country B, where they fled to, the first country of asylum, also criminalizes homosexuality. And so the UNHCR regional office must therefore circumvent the said country's sovereignty on asylum matters and recognize LGBT asylum seekers as refugees under UN mandates before then submitting their cases to resettlement countries. To protect UNHCR's diplomatic relations with the country of first asylum, UNHCR agents must conduct refugee status determination and subsequent resettlement procedures for these LGBT asylum seekers behind what I call a veil of secrecy. I show in my article that the opacity surrounding these procedures antagonizes UNHCR local partners and confuses resettlement candidates. For this short preview of the article, of course, I will focus on a specific aspect. That is to say, I chose to focus on resettlement candidates' confusion when confronted with multiple complementary pathways and their respective selection criteria. According to my observations, LGBT Africans transiting through country B could relocate to the global north either through UNHCR resettlement, through blended sponsorship, or through private sponsorship programs. For LGBT Africans aspiring to relocate to the global north, these procedures I found were impossible to distinguish from one another. In all three cases were countries of destination distant places in the global north, decision makers seemed to be unattainable white expatriates, and criteria and procedures appeared behind a veil of secrecy. The little information LGBT asylum seekers in transit in country B knew about resettlement and complementary pathways to the global north came from informal discussions with acquaintances who had fled their country of origin before them and who were now either undergoing the last screening before departure with IOM or were already in Canada. And in my informant's eyes, the most attractive form of relocation seemed actually to be the one involving private sponsors, which they imagined as whom they imagined as a family of choice in their new country of residency. So in Canada, for most of them. My informants were, however, unaware that some of their predecessors obtained these private sponsors through a blended sponsorship program, that is to say, only after they were selected by the UNHCR through the regular resettlement procedure. And this misunderstanding led LGBT Africans in transit to believe that the key to a fast relocation was actually to find Canadian citizens whom they should persuade to sponsor their travel. As a consequence, many looked for these Canadian citizens online, for example, while neglecting their resettlement procedure with the UNHCR regional office. Similarly, the role of transnational networks of assistance directed at LGBT individuals in countries criminalizing homosexuality was confusing for my informants. That is to say, other UN agencies or international organizations and international NGOs. One of them, the Canada-based NGO Rainbow Railroad, which some of you might know, presents itself on its website as helping LGBT people escape persecution and violence, and quote unquote, providing travel to their destination country and immediate bridging post-travel support on arrival. This, what I just quoted from Rainbow Railroad's website resembles the definition of resettlement, which my informants in their country of transit read on UNHCR's website. Moreover, this NGO is operating from Canada, the country where most of their acquaintances had been resettled to, and the representatives of Rainbow Railroad with whom they exchanged over Skype were white, like the UNHCR resettlement caseworkers they hoped to obtain an interview with. And as such, they viewed Rainbow Railroad's assistant as a hopefully faster version of the UNHCR resettlement program. So when pledging their cases to Rainbow Railroad, they did not mention the asylum procedure with UNHCR resettlement prospects for fear of appearing less vulnerable to the Canadian NGO. Resettlement aspirants did not know that Rainbow Railroad worked with private sponsorship schemes, which risk postponing, if not jeopardizing, their chances of resettlement. So these are only a couple of examples of how these schemes might come in competition with each other in the eyes of resettlement aspirants. So to conclude, the multiplication of programs of resettlement and complementary pathways, but also of diverse stakeholders involved in their implementations, has implications in regions of origin that have not yet been sufficiently researched. This article, I hope, offers to shift the gaze from regions of destination to regions of origin, and it sheds light on the unintended consequences of opaque procedures for beneficiary refugees who struggle to navigate between similar programs running simultaneously, but sometimes with mutually exclusive criteria for inclusion. Thank you. I very much look forward to discussing some of these findings with you.
Thank you so much, Agathe, for your presentation. And now I turn to Meltem for our comment.
Good afternoon, all. My name is Meltem Nelicer, and I'm an assistant professor at the Süleyman Demirel University Faculty of Law in Turkey and an asylum researcher. Today, I'm very happy to act as a discussant these two excellent papers. Starting with resettlement and international law, although just Adel made a great introduction, states retain sovereign competence to decide if and who and how many refugees to resettle. This also leads to great divergences between national resettlement practices with regard to selection criteria and procedures, including eligibility and exclusion criteria. UNHCR usually acts as an intermediary in resettlement practices and facilitates selection and transfer of refugees. And UNHCR's mandate for resettlement is the most appropriate solution and who fall under UNHCR resettlement submission criteria. As mentioned by Adel, the Global Compact on Refugees urges states to enlarge the scope, size, and quality of resettlement programs. Although GCR makes a reference to UNHCR resettlement submission criteria and make a reference to women and girls at risk and children at risk in its paragraph 92 as persons and refugees who should be eligible for resettlement, it doesn't urge states to streamline eligibility or exclusion or selection procedures or selection criteria. Both reports I will be discussing today actually relate to discretionary eligibility and exclusion criteria invoked to select refugees to be resettled in Turkey and Africa, and opaqueness of selection processes conducted by UNHCR offices. I would like to start with Natalie and Yasemin's report. I actually read their report when it was first published, not because Yasemin here shares the same name as my daughter, of course, but their report is such an under-researched topic, namely the resettlement framework agreed under the statement, or so-called one-and-one resettlement scheme. Although there is ample research on the EU-Turkey statement, its problematic aspects, whether Turkey can be accepted as a safe third country, and whether the statement should be accepted as a containment or externalization piece, there is very little research focused on the resettlement aspect of the statement and how refugees are being chosen and selected by the member states under the one-and-one resettlement scheme. I really enjoyed reading their paper based on the fieldwork in Turkey and learned some actually new information, although I'm based in Turkey and I know what happens on the ground mostly, such as that UNHCR Turkey office may reject a resettlement dossier based on the fact that there are serious concerns for integration. Natalie and Yasemin raise an excellent point in their report, namely, in the absence of clear eligibility criteria and definitions of concepts relating to vulnerability, resettlement's declared focus on the most vulnerable remains a discretionary promise. This is certainly true, and I completely agree. Resettlement selection criteria in relation to EU-Turkey Statement 1&1 resettlement scheme is regulated by the standard operating procedures adopted by the European Commission in 2016. In the SOP, mostly UNHCR's resettlement submission categories that are accepted for selection of refugees to be resettled from Turkey to different member states, though member states such as Germany may invoke additional eligibility or exclusion criteria. The SOPs provide some new exclusion grounds and foresee exclusion of families with complex profiles, persons who have refused admission to a particular member state, and really problematically, it also foresee exclusion of persons who have previously entered or tried to enter to European Union territories irregularly from the scope of resettlement. This is problematic. What is also more problematic is that the selection criteria provided in the SOPs are taken as a model in the 2016 European Commission proposal establishing a union resettlement framework. Although the regulation proposal has not yet been adopted, the European Pact on Migration and Asylum, which was published last year, the Commission called for the swift adoption of this proposal. This means if the regulation proposal is adopted as is, this would exclude many refugees who are indeed vulnerable without any individual assessment and consideration from the scope of the Union Resettlement Framework, which is foreseen as a yearly program where member states agree to resettle a number of persons, a number of refugees, another category of displaced persons, and invoke uniform eligibility and exclusion criteria. Now, let me return to Agatha's report. I also immensely enjoyed Agatha's article, which had so many original arguments and assessments. Agatha's report, based on her fieldwork in several African countries, is a must-read for those who wish to learn more about what happens on the ground in Africa and how resettlement and selection procedures work in regions of origin. Her work showcases difficulties surrounding the resettlement of LGBT refugees waiting to be resettled in the first countries of asylum in Africa, which penalize same-sex relationships or does not recognize severe homophobia as a persecution ground. Her report perfectly illustrates how the UNHCR regional office, by fast-tracking resettlement of LGBTI asylum seekers and refugees, actually harms UNHCR's relationship with local UNHCR offices, as well as local partners and NGOs. She rightly criticizes the opaqueness of resettlement selection procedures conducted by UNHCR and the fact that resettlement candidates are not giving detailed information about the process, as well as their prospects. I believe there are two themes arising from these two excellent reports. First, the absence of clear eligibility and exclusion criteria for resettlement and clear guidance to conduct vulnerability assessments erodes to an extent the value of resettlement as a humanitarian tool to protect most vulnerable. Second, as raised in Agatha's paper, but also mentioned in Natalie and Yasemin's report, opaqueness surrounding UNHCR selection processes and sometimes UNHCR actions, although well-meant, such as circumventing local partners for fast-tracking some vulnerable refugee groups or not providing detailed information to potential resettlement candidates, cause harm and damage credibility of resettlement practices. Although finding a solution to these problems is not very straightforward, to improve the outlined shortcomings, it might be the time to consider drafting an international instrument, mainstreaming eligibility and exclusion criteria, and introducing openness to UNHCR involvement to resettlement practices. And I think this also gives us some food for thought, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Meltem, for your great remarks on these two papers that I also, of course, very much enjoyed. And the authors will get the opportunity to comment after we have discussed the 2 other papers and have the comments. But yeah, as you said, the vagueness and opaqueness of procedure that are highlighted by the 2 papers really show not only that it harms protection, but also really creates asymmetry of information for all parties involved in the very complex resettlement process. So we have opportunity to go back to these topics after the second part. Now we are going to turn to the 2 papers of the issue that discuss more complementary pathways. And so we will start with a focus on Europe with a paper by Nick Tan, who is a senior researcher at the Danish Institute for Human Rights and an Asylum researcher. And his paper is Community Sponsorship in Europe, Taking Stock, Policy Transfer, and What the Future Might Hold. Then we will turn to the Canadian example. So as we mentioned at the beginning, Canada is sort of seen as a leading light for various reasons in the context of private sponsorship. It's called private sponsorship in Canada rather than community sponsorship, and these definition issues was also Bill discussed in the panel with Jennifer Heinzman. Jennifer of York University, associate research, and she's the past director Center for Refugee Studies at York University, and the journal used as an American sustaining of resettled refugees in Canada. So really, once you have created a sponsorship, how do you maintain it? And this is implemented by Audrey of Law at the University of Toronto, Canada, and a member of the Asylum International Advisory Board. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adele. Is it my turn now? Wonderful. Thanks so much for having me. Thank you very much to Sergio and to SEPS for hosting this webinar and special issue launch. And my many warm congratulations to Adele and Naoko on editing the special issue. It was a real pleasure to contribute to it. So my intervention, rather than focusing on a sustaining and maintenance of community sponsorship in Canada, will focus on questions of feasibility, implementation, and policy uptake of the model in Europe. And I've worked for some time now on how and why European governments take up community sponsorship models, mostly in terms of questions of policy transfer and policy export. And of course, given that the EU Pact on Asylum Migration calls for a European model of community sponsorship, this is a particularly timely question. So in the piece, what I do is I do some preparatory work on what might be called a typology of European community sponsorship approaches. And I think there are 3 forms of community sponsorship currently practiced in Europe, and this shows a rather wide variation of policy settings. So firstly, of course, community sponsorship can be conceived of as a privately led admission and integration program, such as an autonomous complementary pathway. And this, of course, is the original Canadian approach of private refugee sponsorship. Such programs are firmly separated from state-run resettlement and have been defined as initiatives by private associations with recognised expertise in the field to provide for an alternative, legal and safe pathway. So in the European context, the emergence of the humanitarian corridors system in Italy, France and Belgium is perhaps the prime example of community sponsorship as complementary pathway. Secondly, of course, we can see community sponsorship emerging in the European context as a form of sponsored resettlement, far closer to the work of the previous papers, focused not so much on pathways and access, but rather on a model for integration support for resettled refugees matched with civil society sponsors. So this sort of sponsored resettlement model uses existing UNHCR resettlement channels, including selection, referral, health checks, etc., to admit refugees. And then the sponsorship side is focused on the provision of support after arrival, with the aim, of course, of increased or improved integration outcomes for resettled refugees. In some contrast to the traditional Canadian approach, this sponsored resettlement model benefits primarily UNHCR-referred refugees and does not include the naming of individuals, which I'm sure Jennifer will speak to. So if we look across Europe currently, the German NEST program and indeed the UK's community sponsorship scheme reflects this sponsored resettlement approach. And thirdly, what we see in Europe is perhaps the most recent conception of community sponsorship as a so-called wraparound tool for any pathway to protection, such as refugee students, workers, or family reunification programs. So this definition or this type of program does not focus on the pathway or indeed the legal status of refugees, but rather on civic engagement supporting complementary pathway holders. And it gives rise to rather complex so-called hybrid approaches. For example, the combination of community sponsorship on the one hand with a education pathway on the other, as we see, for example, through an Italian university scheme combining university networks on the one hand for admission, but church networks on the other for community support. So to move then to some sort of tentative findings from my paper, I want to point to 4 factors that are really key to the emergence and potential proliferation of community sponsorship models in Europe since 2015. The first one, of course, is the key question of additionality. And I argue that additionality should remain at the forefront of discussions on community sponsorship in Europe to avoid the effective outsourcing of government responsibility to civil society actors. Now, of course, the overall objective of community sponsorship programs may influence the importance of this additionality principle. So where the primary objective is better integration of refugees, or indeed allowing family reunion, additionality may become less important. On the other hand, if the focus of community sponsorship is the expansion of protection, then additionality becomes vital. What we see in emerging European practice is that additionality is not a straightforward concept. On the one hand, pragmatic considerations may require that community sponsorship programs begin initially within existing state quotas. In such cases, though, a shift to additionality in the short or medium term must, in my view, remain a focus, with the realistic understanding, of course, that some governments may seek to reverse engineer additionality. Secondly, my research shows that while community sponsorship is inherently a bottom-up approach, when implemented, the uptake and establishment of new models are often rather top-down. And this, of course, holds lessons for policy transfer. So European pilots have been announced by governments without significant evidence of civil society advocacy, including in Germany, the UK, and Spain. There are, of course, counterexamples, such as the Italian Humanitarian Corridors program being driven by a specifically community actor. Nevertheless, the somewhat counterintuitive top-down tendency of new community sponsorship models suggests that government exchanges, study tours, and lesson learning at the horizontal level between governments may be the most effective vehicle for policy transfer. Thirdly, new research in Europe shows that local administrations are coming to the fore. So there is an increased role here of regional, city, and municipal governments in the development of community sponsorship in Europe. This, to my understanding, is somewhat distinct from Canada, where the primary actors seem to be sponsors, civil society, and the federal government. Some authors in the EU context have said there's massive potential here, that there is potentially a paradigm shift in migration governance through locally led community sponsorship. And we're seeing the connecting of local governments at the sort of the local level, obviously, with transnational, international actors such as the GRSI and UNHCR. As a locally driven initiative, of course, community sponsorship is particularly well suited to leadership from subnational authorities. And what we're seeing is an emerging track record of some local authorities in proposing, advocating for, and in implementing community sponsorship schemes. The key question in my mind, of course, is whether national governments will remain the ultimate gatekeepers in terms of the uptake of these programs. And finally, of course, there are questions around efficiency on the European community sponsorship scale. So community sponsorship is, of course, assumed to provide better integration for refugees than traditional government-run programs. And there is, I think, agreement in the Canadian literature that community sponsorship positively influences refugees' integration. In Europe, thus far, there is a lack of this clear evidence, and an evidence base is yet to be established supporting the central claim that community sponsorship improves integration outcomes. So proving this efficiency question in enhancing integration will be key to the ongoing development of community sponsorship in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick, for this great presentation and really discussion of models. And a lot of this really resonates in the Canadian context, because we just had a federal election where the Conservative Party actually argued that private-sponsored refugees were integrating better as a reason to perhaps cancel the official resettlement program through UNHCR referral. So it was really politicized in a way that really resonates with your findings. So I now turn to Jennifer, who is going to focus on the question of the sustainability of the private sponsorship model in the Canadian context. Thank you very much, Jennifer.
Thank you, Adele, and good morning, afternoon, everyone. Yes, that's almost an entire topic unto itself. Should we just get rid of UNHCR referrals and additionality and all of those things, to Nick's point? So, but I will try to focus on the paper at hand, and I'm delighted to be here. Thank you, obviously, to all the organizers and the host CEPs as well. It's also a pleasure and an honor to be on the call with one of perhaps the best referee ever for a paper. And this is, I only know this because of Frontiers actually discloses who is the referee. And so that has been a pleasure, really constructive and amazing comments. It's also an honor to have Audrey Macklin as the discussant for this, because Audrey herself has worked on sponsorship and its relationship to citizenship. And, you know, the very question for all of us to think about with sponsorship is this a volunteer project? Is this a citizen-making project? Is this a private, public-private sponsorship with government and civil society? Is this a social movement? And I think I've seen glimpses of all of those, and I think both and all may apply. But what I want to focus on here, of course, is the complementary pathway piece. Back as early as 2003, Barbara Treviranus and Michael Casasola wrote, wow, there's almost nothing about this program called sponsorship. And that remained true for so long. Private sponsorship in Canada is in its 5th decade. But if you look at the corresponding academic literature, and I would say governance of the project, until the last 10 years, the project has largely flown under the radar of government and been a kind of very local, albeit with government, checks and balances and selection approval processes. It's a very unusual program, let's just say. But what I want to focus on, I want to introduce the team who's behind me. So you can see all the authors whom, you've got the special issue posted in the chat, but I wanted to acknowledge all of them. I'm coming to you today from the unceded Musqueam territory in Vancouver, British Columbia, which is one of the 5 provinces involved in this research, or at least one of the sites of the research, I should say. But I want to say that we bracketed the Syrian project, the Operation Syrian Refugees of 2015 onward. And we wanted to look at in this particular paper and this entire project, actually, how did we get to this 5th decade of refugee sponsorship, which has largely been the work of Canadian residents, groups of 5 people, often many more, networks of people doing this work year after year. So we were looking at repeat sponsors. We decided calling them serial sponsors was not the best name. However, we did want to get at what is in the water, what sustains the practice. So that's what we focused on. And I asked members of the team to send me for them was the main point of the paper. So let me just turn to that directly. And I'll just give you a couple of ideas. The first one was sponsors undertake the sponsorship of persons who are ethno-national kin, not just family members. So I think the point here is that there is, to the earlier point about naming that was mentioned, the idea that, naming is a complementary pathway, because for every BVOR, which is another category, we have the blended visa office referred refugee, for every GAR, the government assisted refugee, for every, potentially for every privately sponsored refugee, there may be ethno-national kin. This is a word that we came up with in our paper, but I now realize after I got this paper that we need to queer that and make that maybe kin at risk, or something less about static group qualities of vulnerability. But in any case, the notion that it's not, that naming is derived from, in one sense, the methodological nationalism and the policy gaze in its state-centric Canadian way. If you only see people as nuclear families, you're not going to notice that half of the family is left behind. And some of you on the call have written about naming. Specifically, I'm thinking of the book that Shauna Labman and Jeff Cameron did. So there's a lot out there on that, and I think we're increasingly filling some of those gaps. But one thing that let me just go through the other 2 or 3 points that the people on the team made, and then I'll jump in. The second point was that sponsorship as a program, a complementary pathway, and so on, tends to suffer from this kind of state-centric view. And what that does is our knowledge, and this is why being on an international call today with perspectives from Turkey and elsewhere is so important. We tend to fall into these very Canadian debates around sponsorship, and ultimately what that does is it truncates the very transnational, familial, ethno-national, kin at risk, queer, the queer networks that the Rainbow, the Railroad helps and connects with. Very interesting paper. Thank you so much for those starting points. But that invisibilizes 2 things. One, those transnational links where family members are left behind, and family may not be the IRPA, the Canadian Immigration Act and Refugee Protection Act definition of the nuclear family. But there are lots of examples. Sabine Lair's work has pointed to the fact that IRPA says, hey, you need to think about these extended families, not just your nuclear family definition. But it also invisibilizes something else, which is the fact that many formerly resettled refugees become sponsors, and they partner with their own sponsors or the community in which they live, or both, and they come together. And the racialized diaspora sponsor is highly underrepresented in the discussions we have, but definitely in the literature we have. And Biftu Yusuf, who's also on this call, is a PhD student at York who's working on that very topic. So that is certainly one thing that we try to pull out. In the words of one of the team members, sponsorship has to be considered beyond national context to capture the transnational linkages via family, community, but also broader political contexts that actually produce violence and displacement. And another related point she makes is, yes, this is a personal commitment as a sponsor, but sponsorship is often and almost always community-based. Now, community is a slippery word. Those of us in academic circles have critiqued community. I personally have written about non-communities of the excluded in refugee camps, because I don't think a refugee camp is a community. But that aside, the idea is it's more than an individual and personal volunteer project. It's not just a gig. It's not, in many cases, a one-time thing. It becomes a community practice. And that is really kind of the punchline of the paper, is that this is a commitment that is something that you do. It's something that we do. It might be that our faith-based group does it. It might be that, somebody currently, experiencing a mudslide in rural British Columbia is doing, but it is something much more than just a kind of one-off like volunteer gig, and it's pushed, and yeah, it's given much more momentum by the very transnational networks and the kin at risk, left behind, as it were. Some excellent work that we should all be reading. It's Morris, Hagen, and Leonard have published a paper in the Journal of Refugee Studies outlining how family separation is just so anathema to integration and full participation of a family in a society they're worried about their sister. They might be adults, but they lived together before they came to Canada, and now they're separated. And now people are actually thinking they won't stay in Canada if they can't be together with their family. So I really recommend reading that. Just to finish off, a few more comments, or just one more comment. And that is, well, I think it's really picking up on the notion that additionality is important. We shouldn't discount or reduce the legitimacy of named refugees who come through the sponsorship program simply because they're known to people here in Canada. There are sometimes, to the vulnerability papers that came first, people who are vulnerable are the ones we should be protecting. So we've heard some critiques of vulnerability this morning, critiques of, static, groups-based, kind of blanket, fixed notions of vulnerability, and then how they're undermined and, reproduced or produced anew in different ways by frontline assessments. So I think we have to be very careful to not discount the named category, and to pay attention to the fact that when people feel whole, and we've got just lots and lots of data on this, which I won't get into, but when people are at home, feel at home, it's when they feel whole and they have those family members or those, at-risk friends who were on the LGBT African list with them in Mali and have now been able to find a place wherever that may be. So I'll leave it there, and I look forward to the conversation. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. So to really highlight, the family and the community and just the togetherness importance for the sustainability of private sponsorship, I think. And I turn to Audrey for a comment.
Thank you very much. It is a great pleasure to be here. I have had the great honor of working with Jennifer on our sponsorship project. And what we have been focusing on are people who are predominantly first-time sponsors. And so what Jennifer and her co-authors have brought is really original and vital insights about what sustains these programs. And in addition to that, and I think I know this from Biftu's work, the participation and the role of people who are formally sponsored themselves, or at least formally came as refugees in refugee sponsorship. I can say that in Canada, these are absolutely underexplored areas. And if I can add one more point to that, and this links up in a moment to Nick's work, this idea that sponsored refugees, privately sponsored refugees do better, have better outcomes than those who are government assisted is part of a kind of PR campaign. And I'm not sure that the empirical evidence actually supports it. It's part of a PR campaign by those who want to displace government assisted with private, but it's also part of a PR campaign to help sustain those who do it, in understanding that theirs is a value-added enterprise. And I don't want to in any way diminish the value and the vitality and importance of what they do, but it's important to know going in that people, at least in the Syrian round of refugee resettlement, who were selected as government-assisted refugees were deliberately selected on the basis of what was considered to be, in quotes, heightened vulnerability compared to those who were privately sponsored. That is to say, larger families, more medical issues, perhaps more elderly people, more single female-headed households, and so on. And all of that's a long way of saying that if you were to compare outcomes of government-assisted refugees to privately sponsored refugees who start from different points of departure, then of course the comparison isn't going to be a fair comparison. So I would just inject a note of caution. There's a PR value, and I don't want to come down too hard on it. There's a PR value to saying that privately sponsored refugee outcomes are better than government assisted, but I'd want to inject a note of caution about that, because I'm not sure that's empirically valid, both given the different starting points and also, frankly, given the short timeframes during which these comparisons are being made. I'll just leave it at that. I want to say here that I found both papers enormously illuminating, and Nick's paper really providing much more comparative, nuanced, granular information about how one has to think about any kind of initiative in its local context. What works in one place may not work in another. The idea of having to have some top-down initiative to launch it seems very sensible and understandable. And it's easy to forget that in Canada, there was, of course, an opportunity structure created by government back in 1978. And, you know, I think the emphasis that Nick brings, for example, to city and regional operations that is somewhat muted or missing in Canada speaks to, frankly, the diminished role of cities in our federation and the heightened role of cities in European states. And all of this, it seems to me, to be critically important to acknowledge. What I want to do in a few more minutes here is say something about what I learned from both papers. And there's a lot that I learned, but I will speak just about what they give us insight into about the relationship between resettlement and complementary pathways, the relationship between asylum and resettlement or complementary pathways, and the relationship of the Global Compact on Migration, the Global Compact on Refugees, which neither explicitly discussed, but I want to suggest that there's material to draw from each paper about it. So let me talk about the resettlement and complementary pathways. I would say that the contrast that Nick draws between sort of admission and integration processes versus just integration processes versus a kind of non-refugee defined programs where people might in fact be, broadly speaking, refugees, but they're selected or enter in pathways about education or family or employment. Sounds like it has these are a little better defined perhaps in the European context that he is raising than they are in Canada. The blurriness in Canada to me is more significant than the distinctions. But so what, right? That's not really so what. I mean, that's just a way of talking about the variation. The concern I want to raise, or the question I want to raise, takes us to the Global Compact on Refugees and the point that Nick makes about reverse engineering. What work are these distinctions doing between what is resettlement and what is a complementary pathway? And more specifically, and forgive me for being cynical, what work can states put them to expand or contract their own obligations? And that's sort of the question I want to ask about who cares about the label resettlement versus complementary, right? I think there's work that they do, and I worry about the work that governments can put them to. Now, so in a sense, I don't know that the categories are inherently stable, and they have implications, as Nick says, you know, for things like the concept of additionality. Now, drifting over to Jennifer and her team's co-author's paper, one of the things that comes out so clearly is both what motivates long-term repeat sponsors, if I can put it that way, is a deep commitment to social justice. That's something that we don't see necessarily quite as clearly in first-time sponsors. They say that's their motivation going in, but you don't know how important that becomes in sustaining long-term commitment, right? We only know that that's what they were thinking of going in. Who knows if that has kind of diminished in the face of the extraordinary challenges of actually doing it. So I think it's really important that that come out so as clearly as it does amongst repeat sponsors. And this commitment to the protection of both kin and ethno-national kin. Again, something that this article brings out that other work has not. What this does is reflect back onto the kind of categories of family reunification versus refugee sponsorship and the sustainability of that. If you want to make a program of resettlement sustainable, does this mean that you have to take on board a component one way or another about family reunification? And how does that in turn blur the categories that we're trying to draw? If in a temporal sense, they have to be connected. Right? Even if in a static moment, you can say there's a difference between admitting somebody as a family member and admitting someone as a refugee. And yet over time, the system depends on both. What's going on here, as I understand it from Jennifer's paper, is something that we have to take seriously, which is when the state delegates something to a private actor, it might be a corporation, or in this case, community groups or even civil society, there are internal dynamics to those entities that aren't necessarily shared by government. And if you want to offload responsibility, what are the costs to government in offloading control, and how willing is government to actually relinquish control? Because it requires a certain relinquishment of control over, for example, the selection process, if you want to sustain a program that you have delegated to some privatized, private, in quotes, body. If we take this seriously, this idea of relinquishment of control, this leads us to what's the relationship between asylum and resettlement or complementary pathways? Well, what states hate about asylum is they don't get to choose. They don't have full control over it, right? So here we're talking again about why do they want complementary pathways in resettlement? Because they get to reassert some kind of control over who gets in. And so this raises a question for me about Nick's example of Italy and how one of the complementary pathways you talk about, Nick, involves the church and bringing people over and then inserting them into an asylum process. Well, you say anecdotally, as it were, that almost everybody who goes into this asylum process through that route actually emerges as recognized refugees. But man, I can imagine that coming out differently, especially over time, when you see cultures of suspicion that emerge through all asylum processes. So how do we reconcile the bringing people over and then the reassertion of state control over who gets to be a refugee? So I'm interested in that dilemma. The last thing I'll say is about the Global Compact and the Global Migration and Refugees. So, the Global Compact, these are separated. This whole regime depends on believing that there's a meaningful, significant distinction between talking about migration and refugees. And this is the edifice upon which you have these two silos. But everything we're talking about now, about complementary pathways, about about the linkage between naming and kin or ethno-national kin, is exactly about disrupting that distinction. And so how do these lessons that you both have illustrated so beautifully bring us back to the coherence of the starting point of these global compacts that insist on a kind of irrevocable distinction between migration and refugees? I'll stop there. Thank you for wonderful papers.
Great. Thank you very much, Audrey, for this comment that really brought it back to the point, the general distinction between these two compacts. And I would say also the belief that you can have an orderly system of migration, especially when you look at forced displacement, which is also sort of part of this pact. Now, thank you very much to everyone. And also, again, thank you very much for the opportunity to organize this discussion. So now the floor is open. Firstly, I would say for any of the authors, in response to the great comments that Meltem and Audrey have made, so we don't have a specific order, but you can just raise your hand because I see the hands and then I will give you the word, or raise your hand through the raise hand function. And then I would say after everyone has had the chance to briefly respond, if they wish to, we'll turn to questions. So please, members of the audience, do not hesitate to write your questions in the Q&A. And then I can give you the opportunity to ask questions live, or I will just read your questions live if you ask them. Okay, so now authors, you have the opportunity to respond to comments briefly. Who would like to start? Jennifer would like to start.
Sure, ever so briefly. Thank you, Audrey, for those comments, and to all the other presenters. I'll be extremely brief. I just wanted to capture, to your point, Adele, about the role of government, and to Audrey's last point about the role of government. One thing I think sponsorship manages to do is it takes local actions and individuals and communities working together to address a very global issue. So for a geographer, this is highly, geographical and exciting, because you're like, whoa, the issue may be current displacement from Afghanistan or in Belarus or from Ethiopia, Eritrean refugees perhaps displaced for a fourth time. But this connection between local and global, of course, is mediated always by the state or not. In the case of private sponsors, I'm thinking of a focus group that I ran in British Columbia 3 years ago, where a minister of a church said, I grew up with, understanding that we were one world and that we were all connected and that we have to do, local acts, global, to be a little cliche, but global social justice. So I think there is that kind of impulse of connecting the local and the global that we try to, provide evidence for in the paper, to Nick's point. But the other point there is that with private sponsorship, this is one of those, it's not a dirty secret, but it is a contested, things like quality assurance. The government is now exercising more governance over, checks and balances on, monitoring of sponsorship in Canada. And this is not always being met with the greatest response. Long-term sponsors are saying things like, they don't trust us anymore. And, some sponsorship agreement holders, big, huge faith groups have said, we're going to pause. And in 2019 decided not to take any new refugees as sponsors or as sponsored groups. So the politics and the role of government here, to Audrey's point, is contested. And I just want to kind of unsettle any sense that this is a big happy clappy project and aren't we all so great? Because of course we know that our cold water geography in Canada, surrounded by all those oceans, to Audrey's point about selection, gives us a completely different geopolitical and policy menu of options than our European colleagues on the call. So, and not colleagues, but governments that are represented by the research on the call. So thanks for that.
Great, thank you very much, Jennifer. So now I see that Yasmin, Natalie, and Nick have raised their hands, but I haven't seen who raised their hands first. So please just whoever wants to start.
Nick was first.
So Nick, it's yours.
Thank you, Natalie. That's very graceful. Thanks so much, Audrey, for those wonderful comments, and also Jennifer for a great paper. If I could just make a series of reflections in response to your sort of tripartite analysis, Audrey. So firstly, on the relationship between resettlement and complementary pathways in Europe, it may well be that my paper tries to make sense of current approaches, but you should not be fooled that there is a sense of coherence in European policy making in this area. I really think actually of this space as a contested site where it's a new frontier. There's a new model for refugee protection. There are all sorts of approaches being tested and implemented. And I think my work is trying to sort of synthesize or work towards a principled framework. The reason for that, of course, is that there is potential for abuse, I think, in the label community sponsorship. And we've actually seen that in Eastern Europe, for example. There's been private admission schemes whereby it was confined to Christian refugees. The Australian community sponsorship model is basically a labour migration scheme with a sort of refugee moniker. On the other hand, of course, one could argue that there is great strength in the inherent flexibility of the concept, and that should also be not forgotten in straight-laced legal terms. As to your second point on the relationship between these pathways and spontaneous asylum, a couple of really key dilemmas I struggle with as a researcher here. The first one, of course, is questions of scale. So we see states employing incredibly restrictive, indeed, externalization approaches at borders or with respect to spontaneous arrivals, and then announcing incredibly small-scale sponsorship schemes as a sort of fig leaf. On the other hand, we also see in the UK, for example, really significant energy around community sponsorship among rather significant portions of civil society. So there must be some balance for us, I think, between seeing the whole picture, seeing the whole policy field on the one hand, and then not somehow criticizing volunteers, community members, citizens for stepping up and doing something concrete about refugee protection. And finally, very, very briefly on the relationship between these pathways and the GCR and indeed GCM. My preliminary analysis here is the use of complementary pathways, which are essentially migration pathways, act to hide away refugees in forms of migration corridors, in the hope that refugees will gain a certain level of access and protection without ever having to interact with an asylum procedure. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick. So now I think we turn to Natalie and then Yasemin.
Yeah, thanks. And many thanks to really all the other presenters and discussants as well. It's, yeah, I feel Jasmine and I, we were to focus on whether our PowerPoint works to properly. Also, thank you for the opportunity to be on such a great panel. And it's really, really great, I think, to hear the different papers in conversation with each other. So I have many thoughts, but I wanted to focus on two. So Meltem, also thanks a lot for your very generous discussion of our paper. It was really, really great and highlighted some excellent points, inter alia, the indeed kind of blueprint that this operating procedures document is for the framework that is still under negotiation. And one thing that I was thinking, kind of, thinking these four papers together and the two discussions is a point that you, Audrey, made about this, what states do for PR, and this whole focus on integration outcomes, which I've seen also getting more strongly emphasized in the German discourse, in the European discourse. And this is one of the things that we also discuss in the paper, where states now ask in an anticipatory manner for integration potential, and they do that by asking about parents' willingness to let children participate in mixed gender swimming classes, or about their hypothetical reaction to a same-sex couple kissing on the street. Though very, very little is known about these practices, which brings us back to the opaqueness and how much states are doing that, who gets actually kicked out because of these reasons. It's all anecdotal evidence, which I think is a main challenge for us as researchers as well, if we want to make valid and reliable claims about that. But the main thing that I would like, it's more a kind of thought that I have, but I would be super curious to hear the others reflect about that, is that you have a discretionary policy where you have to do a little bit of PR with regard to, arguing that people will integrate better through complementary pathways and private sponsorship, even better than resettlement, etc. And on the other hand, you have a focus supposedly on the most vulnerable, which is something that, my co-author Saskia Bonjour and I have called, based on other people's research, Sébastien Chauvin and Garces Mascarenhas, as promising victimhood. Refugees have to be first vulnerable while they are there, but able and willing to outgrow their vulnerability in the future. And this is something that, also after 5 years of dealing with this topic, it's something that I still feel like there's a tension that there is obviously in the debate. And it's more thought that I have. So if anyone feels inspired by that, I'd be curious to hear. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Natalie. So Yasemin, would you like to add your comments?
Yes, but it will seem a bit out of place now after Natalie's comment, but I hope we will get back to that. I also wanted to thank everyone, because I've now have so many questions in my head and ideas that it's very difficult to grasp what I'm going to say. But I also wanted to thank Meltem for your very valid comments. And I thought it was very interesting that you shed light on the notion that in the Global Compact on refugees, which is the topic today, that there is no debate on streamlining or on the exclusion practices of vulnerability when it comes to resettlement. And then I wanted to actually point out that in current developments, there's like mixed tendencies now, because if you look at the pact, the EU pact, then you see that the vulnerability categories have been made a bit more restrictive, when you see that particular attention should be paid to persons with immediately identifiable mental disability, or persons visibly having suffered psychological or physical trauma, instead of the more broad definition that was there before. Or if you look at the resettlement framework, the proposal of the Commission, then you see that persons with socioeconomic vulnerability are included and family is included. So at the one hand, additional categories are added. And now I just wanted to raise the question whether how many categories will be added on until the actual causes of the vulnerabilities are addressed by policy, or who is excluded now if the list gets more and more extensive. So I think I'm trying to grasp that in my own research, but I would also like to hear comments on that from the other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yasemin. So is there any of the other authors who would like to react briefly, or commentators? No, not at the moment. So yes, Melton? I think your microphone is muted.
Sorry, it was extremely interesting to hear the Canadian perspective as well, and I have just some thoughts, not perhaps comments, but Yasemin is right. Like when you look at the EU Commission proposal, you see expanded exclusion clauses. A refugee who has been rejected from resettlement by a member state cannot be submitted to another. When you look at exclusion grounds, you see that not just persons with serious who are suspected to fall under the exclusion clauses are not just excluded. They're also not just serious grounds, but like reasonable grounds for considering that a person, a refugee, falls within the exclusion clauses of the 1951 Convention is just enough for excluding a refugee from resettlement. What I have in mind when I heard all your presentation is that when you look at, for instance, you're all more experts on resettlement, I think, than me. So I'm just a refugee law scholar who just, incredibly excited about hearing this. But when you look at the Vietnamese refugee crisis, the CPA, you see very discretionary eligibility and exclusion clauses for resettlement, how the US instrumentalizes resettlement, and Canada and France, and they have very divergent eligibility and selection clauses for humanitarian evacuation programs and resettlement practices. But when we come in 2021, when we have the compact, it doesn't say anything about except enlarging the resettlement practices. And and Yasemin's point that just after all these years, there's not much has changed. Still, UNHCR is somehow conducting most resettlement practices. When you look at complementary pathways, I think Audrey has a great point. I mean, it's becoming more and more PR about the Italian humanitarian corridors. It's like I was reading in news that only 68 persons have arrived so far, which is it's on the news, but tell me if I'm mistaken, it's just one news article, but it's just when you look at the millions and millions hosted by Global South, it is just very insignificant number of refugees being resettled and being, come through complementary pathways. And UNHCR is not trying to perhaps introduce common criteria or to introduce common conceptions of vulnerability. They just issue handbooks for resettlement, and perhaps as the main agency conducting the resettlement, it should have more prominent role, and it should be more active in just lessening the divergences between resettlement practices and making resettlement a purely humanitarian act. Yes, sorry if it's just all very out there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Melton. I guess, would you like to say something as well? Yes.
Right.
I think your microphone is closed.
Oh, I thought it was. I was thanking Melton for her very careful read of the papers, and I really appreciated as Natalie also noted, how the four papers speak to one another so in such a complementary way, and wanted to react to what Natalie was saying, that if this tension is this injunction to promising victim fee continues, what does it mean? And if the actors in complementary pathways become more and more more and more diverse and have different interests in receiving countries. How will these categories of integration of promising integration and vulnerability will be transmitted to these candidates in the regions of origin? I think this is basically what my work is about, is if these actors multiply, then it also means that their understanding of these categories multiply and become more confused, and will be transmitted in a more confusing way to people who are still aspiring to correspond to these categories. And in my work with LGBT resettlement aspirants, it has dramatic consequences if their understanding, for example, of being well integrated or being perceived as potentially well integratable in a receiving country such as Canada means being an openly out LGBT activist, and that they're being told by former resettled LGBT refugees that it means going on the street and dressing in a particularly visible way, then it will have a direct influence on their daily life in transit. And I've seen people being beaten up, being subjected to way more vulnerability, to a direct sense of vulnerability, of an increased state of vulnerability, because they're trying to correspond to the categories that they're being taught by formerly resettled refugees they're in contact with. So this is what comes to my mind when I think of multiplication of these community-led sponsorship schemes. Then I wonder how does the information travel, and through whom, and how is it received in regions of origin?
Thank you very much, Agathe. So I have seen that Jennifer has raised her hand. I just make 2 points briefly before that. Yes, I think this thing of promising victimhood is also related to an issue we also saw in the Asylum procedure, which is the performance of suffering that is requested of people who are falsely displaced to fit into existing governmental categories, and probably will not disappear with the multiplication of actors, which is quite concerning. So I'll give the word to Jennifer and then Audrey, and then we'll have, I'd like to also give a chance to ask the questions that have been raised in the Q&A, because there are 2 very interesting questions I would like to give to the audience, if that's okay with everyone. So Jennifer, you have the word.
And just a couple very quick responses to what's been said, to the point though that you just made too, that this idea of performing vulnerability and victimhood, and then people literally a kind of performativity so that they can meet the criteria is just so so raw to hear about. But also when you juxtapose it with the point made earlier about then having to prove your potential for strong integration outcomes, the irony of the policy and the system is just exposed so brutally. But to Meltem's earlier point too, I think, and Agathe, I mean, the fact that states they are performing exclusion, and it's very upsetting to hear about all the exclusion practices. If one state rejects a person for sponsorship or asylum or resettlement, then other states will do the same. On the inclusion side, something that happened during the Syrian refugee initiative in Canada was that the state had promised, of course, to take 25,000 people in 2 months, which was a very tall order for a brand new government. And so all of a sudden, inclusion and how can we make this work became the question of the day. And from a law perspective, and again, I'm not a lawyer and nor am I a law professor, so I stand to be corrected by those of you on the call who are, but using a prima facie definition whereby the state, first of all, has the discretion to kind of, make the call. They have criteria, of course, but it's a less onerous definition to meet than evidence of persecution or acute promise of persecution. Promise, not the right word, but possibility. So these enlargements, and again, time limited, politically circumscribed, are possible. And it's my understanding that sponsorship, for example, it is also governed by the same notion that the Canadian government can use prima facie definitions, not necessarily convention definitions that have a higher bar. So trying to capture as many of those for this complementary project that we're all talking about here today is important. I haven't mentioned the GCR much. I've written about it elsewhere. And, I do think it attempts to improve. I call it an attempt to improve on the status quo, but I don't think it rearranges the way we think. And, with respect to the programs that we're talking about, perhaps that's not the point here today, but I do see that so much of the GCR is about supporting the 10 states that already do the greatest amount of refugee hosting without giving any sort of longer term protection or reduction of precarity for so many. So I'll just throw that in there because the GCR has lots of bases for being critiqued as well. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much for these important points, Jennifer, on the fundamental critique that we can make of the GCR, and it's important to come back to that. But now I'm going to read out first question by an NGOTS member, because I think it's a question that speaks to many of you, but perhaps especially Agathe on this one. So that's by Rachel McNally, and it's: what do you think is the solution for confusion and misinformation about various resettlement or sponsorship programs amongst refugees who wish to resettle? More information in different languages, sponsoring organization encouraging refugees to pursue the UNHCR process simultaneously. There is a second question, but I'll ask it later, because I think thinking about this from the perspective of a settlement candidate is very important.
Thank you very much for this important question. I think that I will come back to another aspect of my paper, which I chose not to highlight for this presentation, which is the very important role of local implementing actors in regions of origin, which are too often, if not bypassed, not given enough importance by the UNHCR, in my observation. Most often in regions of origin, the UNHCR relies on local NGOs, they called local implementing partners. And those who work in these NGOs, who I call street level humanitarians, those who have the know-how, who have the knowledge of the population who is wishing to be resettled, or who are asylum seekers or long-term refugees. And they know what vulnerability means in a specific context most often. In the case I worked on, in resettlement and complementary pathways, this local organization was not, the knowledge of this local organization was not relied upon enough by the UNHCR. Thinking that resettlement complementary pathways are directed by receiving states. So thinking rather of linking these refugees with organizations in receiving countries, and not thinking enough about how this information is transmitted to the resettlement aspirants to aspiring resettlement. To refugees aspiring to resettlements in regions of origin. So I think this would be my main hint for solution, if I can give one.
Thank you very much, Aga. So Natalie is going to respond. And I just want to say, I didn't want to be impolite and jump over Audrey. She told me that she was keen to hear the audience's member having the opportunity to ask questions. So I'll give the word to Natalie and then we go back to Audrey. So thank you.
Yeah, just very briefly, one anecdote from an exchange with a German state official where I proposed that it would be good to have an overview, because even for researchers who are studying these different pathways for years, it's sometimes difficult to understand who are the actors, what are the practices, what are the criteria for different pathways, and so on. And he literally said that it would be quite challenging to have such an overview. And another thing that is quite crucial, I think, is that you have, until, like, at least for the context of Turkey and Lebanon that I studied, it's streamlined until the UNHCR, but then it really diversifies once it's submitted to different states. And each of these states have then different practices. Some, do the interview online, some have an additional security interview, and so on. And what I found super interesting in my research is that UNHCR sometimes don't know what certain state criteria, even those that are officially in the policy, mean in practice. And this is also why this anticipatory prioritizing then happens, that UNHCR, based on anecdotal evidence often, or some kind of gut feeling or hunch that they have, which dossiers are particularly strong, prioritizes certain dossiers and deprioritizes, how they call it, others. And I think that, the fact that there is not enough transparency between the different policy actors involved makes, of course, the communication towards refugees even more difficult. So yeah, just to add to Agat's excellent comments.
Great, thank you very much, Natalie. So now, if it's okay, I'll give the word to Audrey, and then I'll go back to the questions of the audience.
Thanks. And my comments now kind of are disconnected to a lot of what's just been said, which is all really insightful stuff. But I just want to make two small points, I hope. One is that, this whole kind of vulnerability versus integration capacity in a way just crystallizes the contradictions at the heart of, refugee versus migration, and where complementary pathways kind of try to straddle both of those worlds. But I also kind of think it reflects something about a point that I think Meltem made, which is that there are millions and millions of people who need some kind of remedy. And in fact, there is no non-arbitrary way of selecting them. And language like vulnerability works not because it identifies people who are genuinely vulnerable, but because it has the capacity to discredit everybody else as undeserving. And that the work that vulnerability does is really not about identifying vulnerable people. It's about devaluing and discrediting people who don't fit that classification and rendering them not just people who don't fit a particular category, so what, but making them undeserving, so that there's some moral basis for why these millions and millions of people aren't being chosen. Because if you take that away, then it just kind of leaves us with the idea that we only want to accept X number of people, and we might as well just have a lottery, because there is no meaningful way of sifting between the people. So I do wonder about the proliferation of subcategories of vulnerability, deserving, all of those things, as we're looking for the wrong thing if we're looking for what makes those categories meaningful by looking at them internally. I just don't think that's the work they do. Anyway, that's me being cynical. On a more positive note, I think one of the things that Jennifer's paper reveals, and I think, Natalie, I might be wrong, but it might be your work too, and forgive me if I'm confusing you with someone else, is that when you engage private citizens in doing this stuff, one of the values is that they become over time untethered from what the government's ambitions for them are. And so one example that we haven't really talked about now today is the extraordinary role that German citizens played in helping Syrian asylum seekers in 2015-16, where they did what we would consider to be resettlement work, but for people whose status was not recognized, who were asylum seekers. And how at some point when the German state wanted to reassert control over defining them, right? That, oh yeah, thanks for helping out all these folks, but by the way, we're now going to subject them to an asylum determination process. And if they are refused, we expect you to at least get out of the way or even assist us in preparing them for that reality. And there was pushback, I think, from people who said, no, we're not going to help you in that project. And this kind of idea that you can create a political base of support that becomes loosened from, untethered from, has its own momentum, independent of the state that might have either welcomed or even set them up to do the work, as happens with sponsorship. And that's something that I think maybe has some potential. And I think Jennifer's paper really sort of draws out some of that, and there's perhaps more to be said about it as well.
Thank you very much, Audrey. I'll give you the word, but very, very briefly. And then we have 5 minutes left in the discussion. So I would like to at least ask just one of the two questions that remain, because one of them is, one that I think we haven't discussed very much yet. So Agathe, the word is yours.
Just wanted to react very quickly to Audrey's remark of trying to approach also the social movement approach of this of the momentum around asylum seekers, which had happened in Germany. And I would say that it is much easier if people are already here and people were able to connect with Syrian asylum seekers because they were hosting them, they were helping them to just touch base in Europe. But I think that's a whole different issue if we are here, if we're talking about people who are in the global north and who get to choose or to help choosing those who might be given the sort of the privilege to join them from the global south to the global north. In this case, I think that seeing it as seeing the people connect and push back, as you said, is much more difficult. Because it's a much more bureaucratic process. Was just a thought.
Thank you very much, Agathe. So now there is one question. It's a second question by Rachel McNally that I won't ask live because it has to do with vulnerability categories and especially disability. We have a paper that is forthcoming on this, so I really recommend reading it when it's out by Michael Heine and Annette Kantoyer and colleagues. But the other question that I really briefly want to ask is by Franka Schneider, which relates, and I won't read the whole question because it's very long, but it's related to the importance that humanitarian reputation might play for states as a reason to engage in a resettlement. And I'm actually very sad that Naoko can't be with us today because of the time difference with Tokyo, because she works exactly on this and why Japan engages with very, very small number of people that they resettle. But when they do it, humanitarian reputation has a great role to play in this, in the case of Japan, for instance. But is there anyone from the audience, from the panelists who would like to engage with the question? Agathe, I see your raised hand. I don't know if it's of this question or the previous one, old hand. Okay. Is there anyone who wants to address the question of humanitarian reputation? Not really.
Didn't Audrey already somehow answered this question by talking to how we approach vulnerability? I feel that was a great preemptive way of answering this question.
Yes, that's right. And I mean, I would also say, having worked on the Australian case of refugee resettlement, which we haven't discussed today, for instance, that's really a country that is really highlighting this, also really having a discourse of extreme generosity in terms of resettled refugee per capita. That isn't even true. In fact, we look at the numbers today, but for them, really, it was a part of the humanitarian reputation as a way to deflect asylum seekers. So I think it's one of the most, with Japan, even though Australia has resettled more refugees, but it's very much the case, I would say. I would say Canada is a more complex case, but also because of the role of private sponsorship, I would say, in the Canadian case, and also because perhaps governments have been reacting different. But still, we can definitely also connect this to the issue of the representation of suffering and promising victimhood that was said before. I've worked also in the Canadian case on, once resettled refugees arrive, they have to go through the mainstream resettlement services or settlement services, even though they come as more vulnerable individuals. And sometimes they're being blamed by the settlement services who are there to assist people because they're considered to be too difficult to help. That's the same. It also happens with resettled refugees in the United States. So that process, if you read the work of Jessica Darrow. Yes, that's definitely an important point to focus on. Now we are sort of coming to quite the end. So I'm just looking whether there has been a last question. There hasn't been. Is there any closing point that any one of the panelists would make? So if not, I'm going to say a few words of conclusion as organizer, and then I will give the word to Sergio, who will sort of close the round of discussion for SEPS. So again, I would like to thank every one of the panelists and contributors to the special issue. I think when we started this project with NAOCO, it was before COVID. I had the opportunity, that was the first time I was given the opportunity by a journal to create a special issue. And I think I had, it was great for me to just engage on this question. And I think I did not expect to have such a great range of paper that, as was mentioned by a few panelists, that can really respond to each other on so many issues. And I think both in the context of COVID that we have now, this has become even more critical that we look at this issue because so many people have been banned from traveling. And the Global Compact of Refugees is also a great framework to reflect on all these critical questions that we make in the special issue. So I'm really, really glad, and I encourage everyone to go to the website of Frontiers in Human Dynamics. It's an open access journal. All the papers that we have discussed today have been published and are accessible. So many, many thanks to Nathalie, Jennifer, Nick, Agathe, and Yasemin for speaking about their research, and many, many thanks to the two really stellar commentators that we had on this paper. It was really fantastic of Meltem and Audrey to add your perspective on these papers and show how they all respond to each other and put them in the context of your own work and of the work of the Asylum project. So really, I'm extremely pleased as an organizer. And I also would like to apologize for the sound quality on my end. My microphone really isn't the best. I should upgrade my technology. So again, thank you very much. Thank you very much also for the engagement of the audience. And I really encourage you to go on the site and to read the papers. And now I'll give you a word to Sergio. And before I do, I would like again to thank SEPS and the Asylum project for giving us the opportunity to host this webinar. Thank you so much, Sergio and Miriam and Isabel for helping us with the technology today.
Thank you, Adele. We can hear you perfectly, and thank you for taking us through this amazing panel. I've learned so many things, that are of relevance for the work we are doing in Asylum. Not least this question of how much discretion states have in deciding, who deserves or who does not deserve to be part of these mechanisms. But the question that came to my mind is the extent to which if this actually means that these instruments have no legal implications, because we can agree that they are not legally binding, but is the assumption that states or any responsible actor, part of the implementation of those instruments, may not actually bear legal implications if there are human rights implications, because from all your work, all your papers, the more I listened, the more I understood that vulnerability does raise very serious human rights concerns. The way in which vulnerability is being used actually has the potential and does actually undermine very fundamental human rights, especially questions you've raised, the linkage with security, integration capacity and potential that fascinates me. What is an integration potential and capacity as a mechanism of migration management creeping in these areas? So these are things, what Audrey was mentioning, who deserves, who is not vulnerable, who is vulnerable, how those logics of exclusion, what do they mean? for equality, for human dignity? And how do we read the uses of vulnerability from these lenses? That is the starting point of human rights, irrespective of having, refugee status or not. So these are questions that came to my mind, but also this blurring of categories. The blurring of categories that Audrey mentioned, and that I think is also very fundamental, not only building on her previous writings on resettlement, being more and more in hands of migration management. But the question I had also when listening to all of you is the extent to which these complementary pathways are actually suffering the same, derailing, or is there really a derailing towards migration management in these schemes of a similar nature that we've seen and that scholars, some of you are writing and have written about this, that we've seen in the area of resettlement. So many things that are definitely extremely important when thinking of public policy and what is happening in the European Union, that the paper of Nick has so eloquently and brilliantly also laid down. So I thank you all, really. I mean, I've enjoyed it enormously, and I'm sure we will continue this conversation. We will disseminate and continue to share the findings of your special journal issue and the papers there in our activities. And I wish you all a wonderful continuation of the day, be it evening or morning or afternoon, wherever you are. So thank you.
Thank you much, Sergio, for your wonderful closing remarks. And I also wish you a nice end of the day wherever you are. Thank you very much, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.